Stefan, the Leipzig match, we wanted to kind of dive into that. It sparked a huge discussion on the Substack chat today, which I thought was really, really interesting. I think it's without a doubt now that Leipzig are in full crisis mode. I mean, when you look at the Bundesliga standings, I think they're still in an okay place, right? They're fourth with 21 points after 12 games. That's not terrible. It's not great considering where they wanted to be. But when you look at the recent run of performances and results, it's really not good enough. And then this capitulation against Wolfsburg, who, I thought started excellent to the game. Thiago Thomas, within 30 minutes essentially ended that match. And then, added even more goals towards the end of the game. Manuel scores in the second half. Behrens makes it 5-1, kind of putting the cherry on top for Wolfsburg. It was a fantastic performance by them. It must have been extremely satisfying for Ralph Hasenhüttl, the former Leipzig coach, to go to Leipzig and come up with this sort of performance. But you know what? As great as Wolfsburg were, and we really have to recognize how great they were in this match and how they were really up for it from the very start. And they were extremely efficient. There's no doubt about it. When in the way they put their way, there is their chances. But Leipzig were non-existent. There was no way of no resistance at all towards the performance that Wolfsburg put up. The goals were scored way too easily. Gulassi had a terrible time in net. The defense in front of him wasn't much better. And it comes off the back of, several performances where we kind of just felt that this Leipzig team was maybe a little bit spineless. And this was just another one where you see the talent on the field. You get the sense that there's a lot of very highly talented players with high potential on there, but maybe a lot of players where the final product just isn't there. And I personally think there's a big hole when it comes to leadership.
Yeah, and we've talked about that before, haven't we, in terms of the lack of kind of maturity in that team and the lack of responsibility that anyone seems to take in that team. First off, great win for Wolfsburg. It's also worth noting that Wolfsburg have actually quietly started climbing up the league table. This win now puts them above Stuttgart into 8th place. They're now just 3 points off Leipzig, which is incredible. Hasenhüttl's team are 3 wins and 2 draws in the last 5 games. They've only lost 3 in the last 10. And yeah, you're right. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, I think Hasenhüttl was maybe not really kind of laughed at Leipzig, but I think he was maybe a little underappreciated when he was the head coach there, and he also went off to England, did very well. And I've always been a big fan of Hasenhüttl. I've said over the years, I think he would have made a really smart Dortmund signing when they were kind of just farting around with, the flavour of the month of the Bundesliga. There was this very, technically astute, tactically smart head coach. It was what I thought at the time performed miracles in the Premier League. It kind of fell apart eventually because there's only so long you could do that with limited budgets in that kind of league. And look, maybe he just didn't really have an interest in coming back to Germany at that point, but I always thought he was he would have been a really smart head coach if anyone in Germany in the Bundesliga could have picked him up. Wolfsburg obviously did that, and I think they're beginning to bear the fruits of that. I think he is a really smart head coach. I did a newsletter on him actually when he first joined Wolfsburg, because he was actually talking about after he left Southampton that he was actually considering retiring. He wasn't really particularly enthused about the idea of football management after that stint, and I'm glad he stuck around because he's now showing what he's capable of with what I think is a pretty average Wolfsburg team, to be perfectly honest with you. It's certainly not the teams of yesteryear who were challenging for titles and partaking in the Champions League, but they're doing a really good job. They knocked out Leipzig in this game convincingly, and you're right, it's the same old problems that we've seen from Leipzig. It's a mentality issue. It's a it's a responsibility issue. Maybe it's an age thing. We talked about it on, I'm not sure if it was the previous show that we did this week, but maybe a couple of weeks ago, where they've continually failed to create chances. They give away too many chances. Their XG has been lower than their opponents for like the last 5 or 6 games, I think. And even though Wolfsburg's XG was actually 2.7, which is quite low for 5 goals, obviously due to the fact that some of the Wolfsburg goals were outstanding, still higher than Leipzig's 1.45. And there's just all sorts of problems in that team. And you're right, the thing we kind of talked about in the group chat, and like this is my kind of theory, that they do have a lot of players, and they have a lot of decent players, and they've got decent players in backup positions, and in terms of the actual squad's depth, they're probably quite competitive. But I do kind of think if you kind of go through that starting 11, or what it would be with, players from, or I mean, it's maybe quite hard to actually consider what it should or shouldn't be. But if you kind of go through what you'd think the starting 11 would be, which is, maybe like Sesko and Openda up front, Xavi Simons, Nusa, maybe Schlager and Vermeeren in midfield if you want to be polite, David Raum, Lekeba, Gertruda, Henriks, Galassi. Point I was making in the group chat was if you actually go through that starting 11 and say how many of them would make it into Leverkusen or Bayern Munich starting 11, there's maybe 2 or 3. Even Dortmund's team maybe would you struggle to fit them in a fully fit Dortmund team. And I just kind of wonder if that maybe points to the fact that they do have a lot of kind of depth and they've kind of got, plenty of options. But there are very few leaders in that team. There are very few bona fide Bundesliga stars, and I don't even mean stars in the sense that they're worth like 150 million euros. I mean guys who've just been around the block, guys who know what they're doing, guys who are dependable. Because you could definitely argue that, on paper, Xavi Simons would walk into the Bayern Munich team, but would any Bayern Munich fan actually want him in that team right now? Now, maybe they would have had left wing or something, instead of Kingsley Coman or something, but would I want him over Musiala? No, absolutely I wouldn't. Would I want him over Florian Wirtz? No, I wouldn't. The same could be said for Openda, I think, over Harry Kane. I'd take Patrick Schick over Openda at this point, if I'm being perfectly honest with you. And there's just kind of, it just seems to be this kind of constant theme throughout this team that there's a lot of players who are good on paper, the squad's good on paper, but when it comes to actual real life, technical ability and these guys actually going out and picking up points, they're falling short. And look, maybe that's just a problem with Marco Rose and he's not getting the best out of these players. But I think they're seriously struggling from the players that they sold. And if you kind of look at the amount of talent that's walked out the door in the last couple of years, obviously this summer they sold Dani Olmo, who's I know he had his injury concerns, but he was still a big. He was not only a big player for them, but he was also a big leader. He was a guy who'd walk on the pitch, demand the ball, and he would immediately try to win games. Regardless of how fit he was or how often he played, that's still the case. Simicam was a big player for them, and obviously last year they lost Guardiola, Szoboszlai, Christopher Nkunku, and then even guys like Angelino, Emil Forsberg, Konrad Leimer, Timo Werner. These are all big names and these are big personalities in the changing room, and they've been replaced by these kids that they pick up from Salzburg or loanees that they bring in from PSG or, Fabio Carvalho or, some kid that they signed from Belgium. And like all these kids could be good on paper, all these kids could develop into great players, or maybe they're all really fun to play on FIFA, but in terms of actually winning football games, they're just not doing the job.
I mean, Forsberg is a big one, right? I watched the MLS Cup conference finals yesterday, and Forsberg was a really big personality on the New York Red Bulls team that reached the final of the MLS Cup, right? And by no means was that a pretty football game, and by no means do I suggest that Leipzig shall go and like transplant half of their New York sister club and play in the Bundesliga next year. I think the goal quality is too high, but watching that, you could just sort of sense what the difference was with having someone like Forsberg just even being around, right? And there was a parallel to last year when he left for New York and what he provided, and he's a big one. The other one, and we had him in Leipzig, right, as Dominik Szoboszlai when he came back with Liverpool, and he was part of the press conference there, and we got to speak to him a little bit, and I really thought, wow, there's a player that was a really big part of that Leipzig team that won 2 German Cups, right? But also has since grown in personality enormously. That is definitely something that really stood out to me, how much of a personality he is, how important he is for that Liverpool team, and the Liverpool probably right now the best team in Europe. I mean, everyone was seeing them today play against Man City. It's obvious, and he's a big part of that. And so that's really, I think that is really hard to replace. It kind of reminds me a little bit of, when you play Football Manager and you get these wunderkinds, and you buy them because you know that the potential is super high and down the road it will become high. You used to be able to download these lists of wunderkinds that were available in Football Manager. And it seems like Leipzig have downloaded that list and they bought all of them. And maybe in 5 to 6 years, every single one of them will be stars. The problem is, though, they're not there yet. And so while they might have the most talented team in the Bundesliga, and I have said this often, I still believe that to be true. Potentially, that's probably true. But, unfortunately, you also need presence skill. And you need these guys that have been in the trenches, One of the big things, and I always think about this, Leverkusen used to do pretty much exactly the same thing at Leipzig for years, right? They used to be we buy next year's wunderkind. Like, that's why they signed Klosik, why they signed Schick, all these guys. They brought them in, and it was like one wunderkind after the other. And it's like, that's great when you have these guys, but you also need a Robert Andrich and a Granit Xhaka to do a hard tackle in midfield at some point, or sometimes scream at the opponent, sometimes screaming at your own players and set an example, right? You need to have these hard leadership types in the dressing room. And I don't see a single guy like that at Leipzig. Maybe David Raum is one. He's out injured, of course. I spoke to him when I was in Leipzig, and he's out injured. So, that can be a presence that's missing. Another one is maybe Schlager. Maybe when he fully comes back and finds form, that can be a difference too. But, Leipzig need to sign their Robert Andrich. I think that is what's really missing here.
Yeah, it also, I think, kind of puts the Xavi Simons loan deal into perspective, and it makes you realise how much they desperately wanted to get Simons in the summer, because after obviously what he did last season. But I do kind of think the club were maybe quite taken aback by just how many players they've actually sold in the last 2 years. I don't think they expected to sell Guardiola, Nkunku, Szoboszlai all in the same summer. They obviously got top price for all of them, so they would say that they did what they were supposed to do. But it kind of comes back to that rant I made on Gegenpressing newsletter, basically this time last year, I think, maybe it was actually the start of the end of this previous year, when Stuttgart were obviously still in the midst of being this yo-yo club, and I basically wrote a newsletter saying, what is the point of Stuttgart? And it was basically arguing that every single summer they would sell their best young players, and because they sold their best young players, they would then fall into the relegation race. And then by some miracle, i.e. winning a playoff game, or banking on, Hasenhüttl tripping over their own shoelaces, or fortunately, Sebastian Hoeneß coming around, they would manage to get out of it, but then the cycle would be repeating itself. And you could argue that it has repeated itself to an extent this season. And I would probably argue, if not for Sebastian Hoeneß, then Stuttgart could be easily, not staring relegation in the face, but further down the table. And, to an extent, I can understand Stuttgart being in that position, because, they're a club who have to pay their bills. They're not Bayern Munich. They're not Real Madrid. They appreciate where they are in the ladder and in the hierarchy of things. But Leipzig are part of a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate, and they're at the top of a pyramid of football clubs around the world, and they take advantage of that readily. They have huge sponsorship deals with their parent club. They do not want for money ever, and I appreciate that there's reports that the club have to start paying their own wages and stuff, and I get that, but if the extent of their ambition is just to be Stuttgart or just to be Dortmund and just to sell, and they're all popping champagne at the Christmas party this year because they managed to sell the last player for top price, then what are we even doing here, guys? And it's just, and I can totally appreciate it if Marco Rosa does get sacked in the next couple of weeks and he does a big sit-down interview with one of the German newspapers and says, well, what was I supposed to do? Every summer they sell my players. Like, show me any head coach who could do any better in that circumstance. And maybe someone else could come in and maybe someone else can do a better job with these players. But it just feels to me we keep going in circles with Leipzig here. And I think this season they've been caught out because of how many players they've sold. And they try to cover up the cracks by bringing Xavi Simons on loan. He certainly did that last year, but because he's out injured, we're seeing the whole thing fall apart.
Yeah, I mean, and the Xavi Simons thing is really interesting because they are trying to make that deal permanent, right? pay 80 million euros for him. I think that would be a watershed moment. It would mean real intent, but right now I think they have other issues. I think too, the news today that Ruven Schröder is leaving the club, that he's the sporting director responsible under Marcel Schäfer, who's the director of sport. I've explained in the past the difference between the two, right? The director of sport usually sits on the board, the sporting director does not. That's basically it in a nutshell. Ruven Schröder officially wanted to have a bigger say in the operations of RB Leipzig. That wasn't possible with Marcel Schäfer around, so he has left the club and joined RB Salzburg to be the managing director there. There's a great article on Transfermarkt that one of our colleagues did. Tobias Picker did the article. Almost forgot, yeah. And it was a really good read about all the things that have been going wrong at Salzburg, right? And the poor job Sion Bucher, the former managing director, has done there, putting that team together this year. And Ruven Schröder is now being delegated to go off to Salzburg and trying to fix that. Officially, they're all saying has nothing to do with this. It's just him wanting a bigger role. The two clubs are completely independent from one another, blah, 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 blah. We've all seen that before. I don't believe it 1 second. I think this is a big reshuffle. I actually think this is maybe a sign for things to come, Stefan. I actually thought I saw the news today on the day after of that defeat, and they said, of course, that has nothing to do with it either. I mean, I don't believe in that the timing is just too good. I think there is works in the background happening to shovel everything around. I mean, the only team that's doing currently well is their team in New York, right? Who have a 1 game shot at winning a national championship. But all the other projects are currently stalling, whether it's in Salzburg, whether it's in Leipzig, whether it's in Brazil. All these teams are currently struggling one way or another. And so when you see one decision maker go from one club to another, I don't think that's a coincidence. I don't believe in coincidences, and I'm just really curious to see what's going to happen next from this.
Yeah, and it's like another thing I also raised in the group chat after the Leipzig game was, can we actually state with any confidence that the Leipzig model of developing head coaches has worked either? We discussed it, and we're like, can you actually name, like, maybe there's 1 or 2 that don't come to mind, and I
it's
guess
like from New York to Salzburg to Leipzig.
Well, I just mean anyone who's came through as a coach in the Red Bull model. Either the clubs have any of the head coaches that they've developed exclusively themselves gone on to be undoubted successes at the top of European football. I think Marco Rose is probably the highest profile one right now. You could maybe argue Hasenhüttl. I'm not even sure if he would count as one because he came in.
But he's a Red Bull guy for sure.
And, like I said, I'm a big fan of Hasenhüttl. And to be fair, I still think Marco Rose is a decent head coach. If he does end up leaving at this point, then he'll have a lot to prove because of the way he left Gladbach, the way he left Dortmund, and now the way that he might leave Leipzig. So it'll be up to him to find the right job to kind of get his reputation back on track. But yeah, I'm struggling to think of any proper Red Bull trademark head coaches that have kind of taken European football by storm. And like I said in the group chat, and for anyone who's maybe shouted at their phone right now, I do not count Julian Nagelsmann in that group because I did not count him as a Red Bull head coach because I think he was a head coach by his own right before he moved to Red Bull. He also cut his teeth at Hoffenheim. So I don't know. It's maybe just a little kind of subplot to all this that, if they were developing their head coaches maybe as well as they think they are, they wouldn't be in these problems.
You're right about the only argument you can make with Nagelsmann that he's like maybe a Rangnick product, right? Because he was developed. He's definitely product.
He's an Ulm head coach. He's an Ulm head coach.
Well, he was with Hoffenheim, right? That is a very similar. Like it's all Rangnick, isn't it? It's like all rooted in Rangnick and his type of football. And I mean, you can make an argument that whether that is really replicatable. And maybe Jurgen Klopp is now bringing in his own school of thought. But I see your point. I mean, there's a lot of guys that work in German football that have been through or been touched by either the Hoffenheim school of thought or Red Bull school of thoughts. And then, I mean, ultimately that means Ralph Rangnick. But there's also, you look at the most recent, biggest, the best German export in coaching terms is Fabian Hützeler, right? And he had absolutely nothing to do with either one of those school of thoughts, right? He came through at Bayern Munich in 1860. And so, yeah, it's a really interesting point. So did Nagelsmann, actually, by the way. Nagelsmann too, started his youth career at 1860 and then went on. And there was a certain Ernst Tanner there that now works at Philadelphia Union, was actually one of the best German football minds, now working abroad in the United States, putting a big footprint there. But, that's something that's sometimes overlooked. And I think you're right. There's a lot of good coaches that have been produced that play a certain style of football that German clubs want, but there hasn't been really a revolutionary coach.
I'd actually argue maybe Bayern Munich could produce more head coaches, because Nagelsmann also came through there as well. Topmöller as a Bayern Munich head coach. Someone else who's Hones as well, of course. So maybe Leipzig's just hire whoever's running Bayern Munich's second team. Miroslav Klose as well is another one, actually. Maybe Miroslav Klose. Where's he right now, actually? I think he's doing quite well. He's in
Nürnberg, doing a good job there.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe that's who they should pick up if they sack Marco Rose.
I actually think Tim Walter is a good coach too. He got the most out of a really difficult situation in Hamburg for years and played good football there. And he was with Bayern Munich's, I think, second team as well for some time. Mm-hmm. So, there's, maybe that is actually an unexplored avenue that we haven't really looked at, that maybe we should look more at Bayern Munich coaches and what they produce rather than this Red Bull model, which, is an interesting story.